Expedia and Visit Scotland invite you to come step into centuries of history that await in Scotland. Castles steeped in legend, walk along cobblestone streets. Come share the warmth of stories passed down through generations. This is a place with a past that is fully present today and all yours to explore. Plan your Scottish escape today at expedia.com/Visit Scotland.
You said this place was steps from the water.
We just haven't found the steps yet.
How much did we save?
Enough.
Enough to get lost?
Or you could book a stay with Hilton.
Welcome to your oceanfront room, just steps from the water.
The Hilton sale is on now. Book on Hilton.com or the Hilton app and save up to 20% to get the stay you expected. When you want savings, not surprises, it matters where you stay. Hilton, for the stay.
Welcome to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I am your host, John Viscardo, and with me once again is the great Colonel Kris Thompson. For those of you not familiar with Kris, he was on our previous episode on Creighton Abrams, and today we're going to discuss Heinz Guderian. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the National Armor and Cavalry Heritage Foundation, which is a charity that Kris is on the board on. Kris, can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the opportunity on this. The foundation is a nonprofit. The mission of the nonprofit is to maintain and refurbish a huge collection of historic armored vehicles. They are stored in a warehouse at Fort Benning. It's open to the public on certain days, and you can look them up on their website for their calendar. But we have almost as many historic vehicles from World War I through the most recent conflict as the famous tank museum at Bovington in England.
That's amazing. Yeah, and it's Fort Benning, Georgia, and anyone can go, right?
Yes, sir. Anyone can go. You can get through the gate. You have to check to make sure. There's about 1 or 2 days a week it's open to the public, but it is open for tours, and it will blow your socks off when you see all these vehicles.
Yeah, and you can also donate to the charity. There's a website. It's called, the website URL is armorcavalryheritagefoundation.org. So recommend my listeners check that out. And it sounds like an amazing museum.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. It is.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's jump into the topic today, which is the famous German Nazi general Heinz Guderian. What makes this guy stand out in your mind?
So he is the number one person, I think, in the entire history of the 20th century associated with the term Blitzkrieg. He's referred to as the father of Blitzkrieg, the inventor of Blitzkrieg. So his name and Blitzkrieg go together in many historical circles.
Yeah, it's funny because, Rommel gets all the publicity on the German side, but really there's a lot of talented commanders besides Rommel. When you hear the term tank or Blitzkrieg, there's other generals like Guderian that you should really study.
Well, exactly. And the one thing about Guderian, unlike Rommel, although Rommel ended up being much more talented in the field, and we'll talk about that later, but the one thing about Guderian was into tanks before it was cool. I mean, he was into tanks in the 1920s, right? And Rommel was kind of Johnny-come-lately in 1940.
Yeah, and we talk about this in other episodes, like the airplane and the tank and the aircraft carrier. I mean, they're pretty standard now, but at the time they were novel inventions, right?
And they are. And I mean, it is a good question right now currently as to, is Blitzkrieg still a viable concept in the age of drones, in the age of robots? I just watched on television today, the Ukrainians claim they have launched 10,000 sorties with robots on the battlefield. So is Blitzkrieg still viable? I think that remains to be seen. I'm optimistic it is, though, in the right circumstances. Well,
it's interesting that, technology like the B-52 or the A-10 Warthog, these are old technologies, but they still work. We're still using them. They're still valid and viable. So I mean, as much as, you hear about drones, there's still a lot of old technology, and I say old in air quotes, that we're using.
Well, exactly. And for us in the armor force, we've been hearing that the tank is dead ever since 73 with the suitcase saggers. Oh, that ends the day of the tank. And it turned out to be not true.
Yeah. Well, let's jump into Mr. Guderian here. He was born June 1888 in Kulm, Prussia, which is now part of Poland, into a military family. What was his early childhood like?
So his dad was a lieutenant in a Jaeger battalion as part of the German army. Guderian, in his later writings, was very proud of the fact that he called them landed gentry, but in those days they were referred to as Junkers, basically small landowning people in West and East Prussia. He was seen as a very smart child. Early in his childhood, at the age of 3, they moved to Western Germany. Then they moved into St. Avold, which was, at that point was part of Germany. He said, and his father was still a company grade officer. And Guderian said that because of the limited means of his father, that they were forced to send him to cadet school at the age of 12, where he stayed until the age of 18. And now this is where maybe his personality gets developed later on, but I mean, 12 to 18 is the formative period of someone's life. And cadet schools in pre-World War I Germany, I've read that they had intense discipline. And in his memoir, Panzer Leader, he doesn't say anything about his parents during that time frame, or about visits, or about his father, but it's all about his instructors at the school. And you wonder how much that instilled in him.
Yeah, and that kind of reminds me of Napoleon, not to bring in my other podcast, but I will here. You know, his dad dropped him off at military school at age 9, and I think he saw his dad twice after that. It was just, all you did was military school.
Exactly. Now, the good thing about being in that intense academic and disciplinary environment and being in that area, St. Avold, is he picked up French and English there and then in later schools. And so, you know, by the time he gets into his own officer career, he is fluent in multiple languages, which helps him read a lot of foreign books and research on armor and tanks.
Yeah, and that's a good point we'll come back to later. He's commissioned into the German army in 1908, serving initially in signals and communication units. Where was he posted?
So he was initially commissioned out of his school as a Jaeger officer and assigned to his father's battalion that his father was then commanding. And again, here's where his story gets interesting, because his dad sends him, pre-World War I, sends him off to telegraph school, communication school, from his Jaeger battalion. And there are some reports saying that Guderian was wanting to get married to his sweetheart, and his father felt he was too young, quote unquote, to get married. So he sent him away for a year to communication school. And then from that point forward, he was viewed as a communication specialist. But then Guderian comes back, gets married in 2013, and you know, had his wife with him the rest of his life. But that whole thing about going to communication school, Guderian really doesn't talk about that much either. And you would think that, I mean, most people assume that that's where he got the inspiration for later wireless radios being in tanks, but he doesn't talk about it that way. Matter of fact, he doesn't even bring it up. I mean, you get the feeling he was a little bit maybe resentful at being sent away again when he had the sweetheart, you know, back home with his father's battalion. So it's interesting. There's a couple ways to look at that situation.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, the motif of this episode is probably going to be Blitzkrieg, but in order to operate fast, you have to have good communications, right?
Right. Well, exactly. And, you know, we'll get into that, but this was the age of the wireless radios becoming rampant throughout all the militaries. And Germany maybe had a little bit of an advantage because they were kind of building their armored forces from scratch. Other armies, United States, France, Great Britain, really weren't focused on it at this time. And so Germany had kind of a 10-year head start, and they had the opportunity to really put those radios to good use.
Yeah. Guderian serves in staff roles during World War I, gaining experience in modern warfare coordination. And this is more of a general question for you, Colonel. Why is staff work so important in becoming a good commander?
It is because it gives you, I think, a realistic view of your unit as a whole. And just as an example, in the United States Army, in armor forces or mech infantry forces, your accession might go like this. You come out of officer basic course, you become a platoon leader, then you become maybe an XO, executive officer, senior first lieutenant. Then you become a staff officer, maybe S4 or S1, or a squadron motor officer or battalion motor officer, which is a captain level position. Then you go to a company command or troop command or battery command position as a captain. And then you go back again to staff as a major. But it really gives you the rounded experience you need to understand how everything in your unit works, which is vital.
Yeah, that's really good points right there. Yeah, it's great to be a platoon commander and be on the front lines, but you also got to learn about logistics and how things work behind the lines. And yeah, that's a really good point.
Well, especially in the armor forces, it's all about fuel and main gun tank rounds, right? And those are, and maintenance on these vehicles. And so if you don't understand maintenance and parts and replacing track, pulling the tank engine, what's called pulling the pack out to give it a service, if you don't understand how fuel trucks work, where the fuel comes from, how it gets distributed out to units, to the troops or companies in the battalion, how ammo gets distributed, you will be an incompetent commander of that unit.
Yeah. Well, after World War I, Guderian remains in the small corps Reichswehr, one of the few officers retained after Germany's defeat. How small was Germany's army at this time, and did it have the effect that the Allies intended after World War I?
It was really almost non-existent. The Versailles Treaty, and then there were several other documents that were signed by the victorious countries that really hemmed in Germany. So first, they were limited to an army of 100,000 troopers or soldiers. Second, they were not allowed to have armor, tanks, or airplanes, or poison gas. Third, they had to pay a massive amount of reparation.
Yep.
And so what it did, it strangled their armed forces. Really, the only thing they could be used for is to suppress internal opposition. They had no offensive capability whatsoever. And those reparations were so heavy, it created a ton of resentment. It essentially turned Germany into a vassal state, right?
And you have these other officers or non-commissioned officers or just privates that are either on half pay or not employed at all, and they're just resentful.
Well, exactly. And the other interesting part to me is, number one, in the Versailles Treaty, I think the most important thing that the victorious countries were wanting to keep a handle on was tanks. So even in 1918 and 1919, the Allies knew that the tank was critically important in the future. And it's interesting that despite all the restrictions on Germany, they tested tanks in Sweden and in Russia. Guderian himself went to see German tanks being developed in Sweden on contract, went to see field trials in Russia. And so even though the Allies knew that the tank was critical, it was the Germans on the sly that got way ahead of the Allied countries on developing the tank.
Yeah, this next part's interesting. Guderian became a leading advocate of armored warfare, studying British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller and Hart, and he authored a famous book called Achtung Panzer in 1937, outlining the principles of fast, concentrated tank warfare. Why is this book still read and respected today?
This is probably, out of everything in this podcast, this is probably the key issue when it comes to Guderian. Here it is. This is the book that I purchased, I think, as a young captain. It is kind of the Blitzkrieg Bible, if you will. But I think it's important to kind of put it in perspective about how it came about. So you had J.F.C. Fuller, a British staff officer, who did the planning for the big tank battle in World War I at Cambrai. And Fuller did a lot of prep work after the war, talking about layering heavy tanks for a breakthrough, then medium tanks to exploit, talking about troops coming behind, talking about airplanes coming in. So there was a lot there that Fuller came up with. However, Fuller, even though he was a British retired officer, loved the Nazi Party. He loved Hitler. He even met with Hitler in the 1930s. So Fuller, I'm not sure if that's why he didn't have the same influence perhaps that Guderian did in their home countries, but Fuller kind of set the table for the full concept in Achtung Panzer. Little Hart came in. Little Hart talked about the expanding torrent, the indirect approach. He was more conceptual. He also talked about the importance of breaking the psychological and the emotional spirit of the enemy. I wrote a paper, actually, that was a 3-part study about mounted warfare that was published in the 125th edition of Armor magazine. And I talked about the fact that there's, when you talk about tank warfare and shock, the impact of shock of an armored attack, there's kind of 2 components, physical and psychological. And physical being you got tanks running through the soft areas, the airfields, command posts, logistics bases. That's the physical shock. But then you have the mental, psychological issue. They're in our rear, and they are cleaning up back there. We can't get gas because they're back there. So so Liddell Hart talked about that.
And if I were to shorthand Blitzkrieg, it would just be, air attacks to kind of psychological and damage the line, punch a hole through with your armored tanks. And then, like you said, you're in the command posts and fuel dumps before anyone knows what's happening. And then you let the infantry sweep up the remnants.
Here's the brilliant part of Achtung Panzer, which makes Achtung Panzer kind of the equivalent in the armor force, mounted forces, planning operational level stuff that makes it the equivalent of Einstein's theory of relativity in terms of being earthbreaking. And I want to read something out of this that explains the whole thing. And this is where he goes to that next huge leap beyond Fuller and Little Hart. Some powers may have considerable natural resources and colonial territories at their disposal and derive therefrom a considerable degree of independence, both in war and peace. France and Great Britain and Poland. Others, who are no less viable and may indeed often be larger in terms of population, will possess a very restricted base of raw materials and few colonial territories. Because they live in a state of continual economic stress, they are not in a position to sustain a long war. So Guderian's theory and his concepts explained in this book, where you do the breakthrough and then you expand that breakthrough, and he even says it on the title. It says, Development of Armored Forces, Tactics and Operational Potential. So strategy is like global diplomacy, economics. Tactics are battles.
Some things happen fast, like a vacuum finding your lost earring. A dog reacting to the word walk. And settling up with friends on the PayPal app. Send and receive money in seconds. Access your balance to send, shop, pay bills, and more. Download the PayPal app to get started. An account with PayPal is required to send and receive money. A PayPal balance account is required to hold and use a balance.
Operational levels are campaign winning issues. And so he takes this armored force and talks about how to win a quick campaign, a quick war, tailor-made for France and Poland.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and take us there. World War II starts in 1939 in Poland. Guderian played a central role in developing the Blitzkrieg doctrine, rapid combined arms offensives. Does this book or this strategy explain Nazi Germany's early successes in World War II?
Sort of. Poland, they really didn't have the concept totally refined or the equipment for it. I mean, part of it is, the key part of the concept is you mass tanks at one point of impact, a Schwerpunkt, a main effort, or whatever you want to term it, on a narrow frontage, and you have all arms, engineers, infantry, similarly mobile, so they can keep up with the tanks, maybe even mobile artillery. You have dive bombers running in front of it. So in Poland, they really didn't have that sorted out quite yet. Guderian's Corps had 2 motorized divisions and a panzer division. Now, he did great. He was on the north end. If you're looking kind of as they went into Poland, he was on the far north, and he penetrated across the Polish corps, or the corridor into East Prussia, and then he swung down behind the Polish forces on the boundary line that had been agreed to with the Russians, but it still wasn't classic Blitzkrieg. Now, going to France, 1940, this is the prototypical Blitzkrieg campaign. The German army had 10 panzer divisions. They had a number of motorized infantry divisions. And so out of their 10 panzer divisions, they massed 7 of them in their main effort, which is where Guderian was. And Guderian had 3 panzer divisions and the Gross Deutschland infantry regiment in his corps, which is essentially a small mechanized division. And so they launched into France on through the famous Ardennes Force, the Manstein Plan. He penetrated all the way to the coast to Abbeville, the first German to reach Abbeville, which is about 100 miles south of Dunkirk. But that cut off essentially a good part of the French forces as well as the British BEF. And so that was classic Blitzkrieg doctrine in action. It wasn't perfect. I mean, Guderian in his book Panzerleader kind of criticizes a lot of his subordinates, and he's got an ego, like many senior officers. And he goes, if it wasn't for me, they'd have stopped at that river, whatever. So it wasn't perfect, but the push really helped. And on this, I want to add a key point. I talked to a officer I served with, who I've known since we were both captains at the armor school, which was then at Fort Knox. He graduated from the French Cavalry Armor School at Saumur. He was fluent in French, lived in France, knew a lot of the French officers, knew their history. He's done work after retirement with the Department of Defense and the Secretary of State regarding French or French-speaking countries. Really top-notch officer. And I said, how do the French view 1940 and Guderian and the Blitzkrieg and all that? He says, basically everything we read about that is mostly from English-speaking authors, right?
Right.
And he says everybody gets the impression that the French army disintegrated. And he said the French will go to great pains to tell you that's not true. And he gave me a couple items on that. And I looked him up, and he was dead right. And one is the Germans had 2,400 tanks total in those 10 panzer divisions for their entire invasion force. Out of those 2,400, the French destroyed 900 of them. Well over, that's like 40% of the German tank force got whacked. And whereas the French tanks, mostly, they lost 2,700 tanks out of 4,000, high number, but a lot of that was mechanical breakdown and also the fact that they ran out of gas. They didn't have access to gas because their supply lines were cut off. The French will tell you, we fought that armor, we fought the Blitzkrieg forces very, very viciously, but we were just outmaneuvered.
Yeah.
And General Gamelin, the French commanding general, is kind of looked at as being at fault, as being the villain on this.
Yeah.
But really interesting angle there.
Yeah. Guderian led panzer forces in the 1940 invasion of France, helping achieve a breakthrough at Sedan. I know Rommel gets a lot of credit. He had the famous Ghost Division because they were so far out in front, nobody knew where they were. But does Guderian deserve more credit from historians here?
He does. I'll just say sort of. So this is a great comparison, though, between Guderian and Rommel. Guderian grows up in Prussia. He grows up in a military family. I mean, from his birth until his dying day, he was a Prussian officer in that environment. Rommel grew up in southern Germany, son of a school teacher. Guderian was in radio stations or commanding communications unit in World War I that he never really talked about after the fact. Even though he won Iron Cross first and second class, he really didn't feel like talking about it much in terms of impact on his life. Here's Rommel down on the Austrian front, commanding platoons, companies. He ends the war basically commanding a battalion-sized unit, a detachment. He wins the Blue Max, the Perle Mérite. So Rommel becomes a favorite of Hitler. You got to say it, Rommel had a much better personality. And so Rommel was assigned to his Panzer Division 5 months before the May 1940 invasion, whereas Guderian had been with tanks for almost two decades. Rommel's just so charismatic, and his soldiers loved him. His superior, even though he was kind of outside the bounds a little bit, sometimes with his superiors, they liked him, right? Guderian's personality was his biggest issue. He was hot-headed, he was strict and precise and stubborn, and this comes up later. Rommel was kind of the Brad Pitt of the German armor force. I mean, he was the man after World War I, and in the 7th Division, he got a lot of press because he's probably a lot better copy than Guderian was in terms of personality. And then we go on to Russia, and Rommel goes down to North Africa. But I think it was the personality thing is why Rommel gets a lot more attention for 1940.
Well, yeah, and you got to know how to play the game as a senior officer. You gotta have that delicate balance of political acumen and military ability. You know, it's tough.
Yeah, and he was in charge of Hitler's bodyguard during the invasion of Poland. Hitler just adored him, and many of the interactions for his whole career between Guderian and Hitler were kind of frosty and kind of rubbing each other the wrong way.
So he's known for his aggressive tactics and frequent clashes with superiors over operational decisions. But yeah, his relationship with Hitler just seems like it just was never there like Rommel's was.
So it's interesting because early on, before Poland and before France, he met with Hitler a lot. Hitler, matter of fact, attended one of Guderian's first demonstrations of mock-up panzers, which were basically trucks with boards mounted for turrets. Hitler loved it. In the Polish invasion, Hitler actually met Guderian in Guderian's home because Guderian's axis of advance took him right past his old home in West Prussia. Hitler met him there, and after the Poland invasion, he met with Hitler some more. There were private dinners together, but we'll get to it later about Russia.
Well, you know, you're a colonel. You've been in the Army. In a perfect world, you just want to be left alone to run your unit and your troops, and you don't want to have to play the political game, but it's part of the job, right?
You have to. And there's a lot of things, that go back in every army. Well, is he a good field officer? Is he a good officer on parade? People you work with, you might not agree with, but at the same time, an army doesn't work unless it works as part of a coordinated machine, a coordinated effort. And Guderian would repeatedly and even in the invasion of France, he was told to slow down. And in this occasion, it's probably good that he did disobey. But you can take that so far. If you do it all the time and you do it as a total pain for the people that you work for, you're not going to make it very far.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of what comes up here in Russia. In Operation Barbarossa, he's commanding Panzer Group 2, advancing rapidly to Moscow. And as we all know, they don't end up taking Moscow, and he's dismissed in late 1941 after disagreements with Hitler over strategic withdrawals. So what happens here?
So this is interesting because the key question, I think, with Guderian is what happened to Blitzkrieg on the Eastern Front? Why didn't it work? And if you compare France, they had 10 panzer divisions. 70% of those, 7 of those panzer divisions, were concentrated on a 50-mile frontage in the main effort. Then on the Eastern Front in 1941, Army Group North was going to Leningrad. Army Group Center, where he was assigned, was going to Moscow. Army Group South was going to Kiev and the resources down there. That is a 1,000-mile frontage. And the Germans put 50% of the panzer divisions in Army Group Center. Half of those, 7 of those, were under Guderian's command. They had 3 panzer divisions in the north and another 5 in Army Group South. So they spread their divisions out over a much wider frontage than they did in 1940. And so Army Group Center is making great progress. Guderian's, he was basically an armored army commander, 3 corps under his command, and the Grossdeutschland infantry regiment, which was very elite. And he was assigned to go after Moscow, and he got close to Moscow. Then he gets an order from Hitler to help out Army Group South toward Kiev because they're having trouble. And Guderian objects, but he goes along with the order. He transports all his people a few hundred miles south to help out, then brings them back to the doorstep of Moscow. But then Father Winter closes in and he pulls his people back, despite the order of his army group commander, von Kluge, and Hitler's direct order. And Hitler's had enough. And von Kluge was really critical also. You get the feeling that by December, which is only 6 months after this campaign began, von Kluge has had enough of this guy. And Hitler has had enough of this guy. And, you know, your skill will take you so far, but if you are a pain for the people you work with, you don't work with your fellow commanders, you're not supportive of your boss, I mean, what do you expect?
Yeah, I mean, look at General Patton. You can be the greatest army commander of all time. If you're annoying your higher-ups constantly and doing dumb things that embarrass them, you're going to go on the sideline.
Well, exactly. And Guderian didn't have the charisma or the it factor. You know, this whole podcast series of yours, which is awesome, by the way.
Thank you.
But it's about the art of command. And so, Guderian had no it factor. He really didn't have unbending loyalty from the people that worked with him or that were around him. And whereas Patton had a great deal of charisma, Rommel had huge charisma. So I think the people they worked with and for were willing to put up maybe with a lot more, but Guderian was not worth the trouble, I think, for his superiors.
Yeah, and I wish we could tell people what the it factor is, and maybe that's the object of this podcast, is like if we could put it in a bottle and have everyone drink it, and then you had that natural ability and that charisma and everybody loved you, everyone would do it, but we don't. It's hard to identify what it is.
It is. And I've worked I grew up in the famous 7th Armored Cavalry Regiment, the Black Horse Regiment, and I was so lucky to work for squadron commanders, regimental commanders that all of them had that it factor. I remember these people, I mean, you would die for them. You loved them. They had that sense of humor, that swagger, that you knew that they were going to win. You knew that if you were with them, you were going to hand the enemy their hind end. And whatever you did, you know, it takes some charisma, it takes confidence, it takes skill. They have to believe you know what you're doing. I know one regimental commander told me, and this was a kind of a famous saying, he says, lead from the front, lead by example, be technically, tactically competent. And that's a good start. But then you got to have that personality it factor. They have to want to be with you because you're the best choice for them to be successful. It's hard to define. It's like, but you know it when you see it.
Right.
And I remember one regimental commander that we had, Tommy White, who was we worshiped that man. And Rommel, I think, had that. Yep. You hear about all his subordinates talking about him. You never hear any subordinates of Guderian talking about him after the fact, after the war, about how great he was. I mean, they all admire this This is something that will never go away. They admire that. It is the theory of relativity for armored forces. But in terms of his leadership in combat, you don't hear all that much like you do for the other famous generals running around.
Well, Hitler didn't keep him on the bench that long. He's recalled in 1943 as Inspector General of Armored Troops, responsible for rebuilding Germany's panzer forces. So why do you think he was recalled?
So I think Hitler was running out of options, number one. I mean, he had people that were deployed in the East. They had just lost North Africa. Rommel was kind of worn down at that point. I think Hitler was under a lot of pressure. Guderian was pretty clean in terms of, he wasn't part of the big disaster on the Eastern Front. And this is where the story gets interesting as well. Guderian describes during this time frame and later, for his next job, but Guderian talks about frequent conflicts and arguments with Hitler. And it's interesting that the German generals that believed in Blitzkrieg, the Rommels, the Guderians, the von Thomas, who was the Africa Corps commander, they all liked a mix of heavy, medium, and light tanks. They liked the medium and light tanks to do the exploit, to go running in the rear, shooting up, because a light tank is still, in those days, was impervious, pretty much to enemy fire, but they could cover a whole lot of ground, right?
Right.
And so during this 43-44 period, the German army was focused on cranking out Tigers and these massive tanks oriented on defending the Eastern Front. And I'm sure that didn't sit well with Guderian. Guderian wanted mobile, fast tanks that could maneuver quickly, and they were kind of going a different direction.
Yeah. Well, he's appointed chief of the general staff in 1944 following the July 20 plot to assassinate Hitler. Rommel is famously forced to commit suicide. Was Guderian a diehard Nazi in your opinion? Because it seems like Hitler's only surrounding himself with loyal yes men at this point.
This is another really, I think, controversial, interesting question about Guderian. Guderian, in one of his conversations with another German general after the war, said the principles of National Socialism are still valid. And he said this after the war, after all the Holocaust stuff came out. He was a Nazi. He believed in the Nazi Party. He believed in Hitler. Now, that being said, there's also reporting from a number of sources that said he was actually approached for involvement in the assassination plot in July 44. And that he waved it off. Nobody says that he was involved in the actual plot, but he was approached and he knew about something was brewing, and he didn't say anything to Hitler or anybody else. And then after July and the plot goes down, Hitler's still alive. Hitler puts Guderian in charge of what's called the Wehrmacht Honor Court, because these officers under German law had to be discharged first before they would be subject to the civilian tribunals that were going after the plotters. And so Guderian essentially ran the army court, which was the first court of inquiry about officers being involved in this, which is kind of, when he knew about the plot, you wonder what these guys that knew about that are saying. Well, here he's sending us off, but we approached him. So,
well, yeah, and it had to be awkward for him because he probably knew a lot of these guys personally.
The other weird part about this time frame, and this is reported, it wasn't just Guderian, but Guderian, on one of his last visits to Berlin and Hitler, they almost came to blows. And it was reported that Guderian, stubborn, he would not budge an inch on this discussion, and he was very dismissive of Hitler. And Hitler got so mad that he got right up in his face and had his fist right next to Guderian's jaws, and Guderian just stood there. Then Guderian lost his temper, and the staff officers had to separate him for like 30 minutes, and then they brought Guderian back in, and the reports were Hitler was worn out. and Hitler was slumped in a chair. Guderian didn't give in. So Guderian flew out of Berlin. I think this is maybe a month or two before the end of the war, made it to the western side of Germany and surrendered to the Allies.
Yeah, he's surrenders in 1945. He's later released without trial and dies in May 1954. What do you think his involvement with the Holocaust is? Because obviously he's on the Eastern Front, so he must have had Einsatzgruppen with him.
Well, exactly. That's the issue. There's no doubt that they had Einsatzgruppen. He commanded 3 corps. So his AO, his area of operations, is quite large. And same thing in Poland when he was a corps commander. You have to think there were rail shipments of Jews coming out of Russia from his sector, or Einsatzgruppen massacres. And if they were in his sector, clearly he knew about them. And if the rail was transporting Jewish victims out of there, going back to the camps, then he had his staff and he had to know about that. They were taking trains away from him. I mean, there's every indication he was well aware of what was going on. After the war, he was begging off. I mean, you talk about the clean Wehrmacht, the good Germans. We didn't know and we weren't aware. I think it's all, that's all poppycock.
Yeah, it is. It's all bunk. But in the Gypsy Roma population, anyone who was handicapped in their mind, it was a lot of people that they just deemed undesirable, and it's just really unfortunate. So that kind of factors into his legacy. What is his legacy?
I think his legacy is this book. This is, for all his faults, for all his lack of personality, for all his tough relations that he had with working with teammates and working with people that worked for him and his bosses, for all the issues he had there, this concept was the key concept. Now, I think later in the war, in Russia, it was simply too broad of an expanse. They did spread their panzer divisions out. So were they massing tanks in certain areas? Yes, but they kind of fell away from the Blitzkrieg theory then. In the Ardennes, they tried to go back to the Blitzkrieg theory. They had about 1,000 tanks involved in the attack in the Battle of the Bulge, but the Americans really developed the anti-Blitzkrieg formula in the Ardennes, which Guderian had talked about in his book about how to avoid this. But you set the shoulders of the penetration to keep that gap narrow.
Yep.
Then you feed units into the flanks of the penetration so they can't spill out and start rolling up to the flank. Then you put in some obstacles, blow bridges to slow down the penetration.
Yep.
And then once you have them in that narrow corridor, they're yours for the taking, which is why Patton always said, hell, let them go all the way to Paris, we'll bag them all. Right.
And I think the Russians got wise to it too. I mean, after some initial struggles, they said, well, yeah, let them come through. We'll just pinch off the salient once they're through, and then we can deal with it that way.
Well, actually, exactly. And Kursk is probably the best example of that. The big salient of Kursk, the Germans hit it from both sides with some heavy-duty tank forces. But the Russians simply laid those obstacles out, anti-tank ditches, wire, which can screw up the tracks and the final drives on the tanks, minefields. You slow that down, and then you start feeding units in from the flank.
So the legacy would be obviously Holocaust, which was awful. He was definitely a participant within. But he was also, I guess, father of the Blitzkrieg and perhaps one of the best German generals of World War II.
I think, well, in terms of conceiving how Germany could beat France and Poland, it was his theory. And again, the Blitzkrieg is the theory of relativity for mounted maneuver warfare. And so I don't really put a whole lot of praise onto the way he commanded. I think there's a lot of German generals. Rommel proved it. He took command of a panzer division, and in 5 months, he was moving out toward the coast, right? So, yeah, I think they had a lot of choices there for the invasion of France. But you got to give him credit for all the synthesizing all these different theories, and explaining why this is a campaign winner. To win a rapid war if you don't have the resources for a long-term engagement like World War I.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, Kris. That was fantastic. I do want to call out, again, the National Armor and Cavalry Heritage Foundation. You can go to their website, and you can also visit their museum in Fort Benning, Georgia. For those who are interested, please go to the website, and if you feel like it, make a donation, because it sounds like a great organization.
Great. Yeah, thank you. It is. And if you're in the Fort Benning area, Columbus, Georgia area, please look up on the website and go by and visit. They've got Tiger tanks. They've got M1s. They've got tanks from World War I. It's an amazing collection.
Yeah, bring the kids. I'm sure it's quite impressive. All right, Kris. Well, thank you for that, and we will talk soon, my friend.
It's been an honor. Thanks, John.